The chandeliers of Valethorn Palace blazed like the dying light of 1,000 stars, their crystal arms dripping gold over a feast hall that smelled of roasted boar, aged wine, and the particular kind of cruelty that flourished in places where power went unchecked. Seraphine moved along the far wall, the way she had learned to move through all grand rooms quietly, with her shoulders drawn in, her silver tray balanced against her forearm, her eyes fixed on the middle distance where no one important ever looked. She was 18 when they brought her here. She was 22 now. In those 4 years, she had learned that invisibility was not a gift, but a discipline. And she had mastered it the way some girls mastered music or embroidery out of pure necessity. The hall of Valethorn could seat 300 wolves. Tonight, it held nearly 500. Bodies pressed between the long iron tables and the carved stone pillars. Every ranking alpha in the Northern Realm gathered for the mid-year assembly. The smell of them was overwhelming, pack scent layered on pack scent, dominance musk and territorial posturing that made the back of Seraphine's throat ache. She breathed through her mouth and kept walking. She had been assigned the Eastern wine circuit. Refill, withdraw, refill. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not raise her eyes to any alpha above the rank of beta. The rules had been given to her by Lady Mordecai Voss, the palace stewardess, a woman whose smile contained no warmth at all. Lady Voss had taken particular care to remind Seraphine of her place before the night began. "You are wolfless," Lady Voss had said, leaning close enough that Seraphine could smell the bitterness beneath her perfume. "A ward of the Crown's charity. The guests tonight are the most powerful wolves on this continent. If you embarrass me, if you so much as breathe incorrectly in their direction, I will have you dismissed from this palace by dawn." Seraphine had said nothing. She had long since stopped offering words to women like Lady Voss. Words were currency in Valethorn Palace, and she could not afford to spend them carelessly. She reached the first cluster of seated alphas, 3 men from the Western Ridge Pack, loud with drink and the particular arrogance of wolves who had never been told no. She filled the nearest goblet without looking up. A hand closed around her wrist. "Stop." The voice belonged to the largest of them, a man called Lord Brecon, his neck thick with old scar tissue. "What is this one?" He addressed his companions, not her. "A wolfless girl, serving at the assembly?" "Lady Voss assigns the staff," Seraphine said carefully, keeping her voice level. "My lord." Lord Brecon's fingers tightened. "Not quite painful. A demonstration. I did not ask you to speak." She held still. Panic was a scent, and she would not give him the satisfaction of smelling it on her. "Let her go, Brecon." The second man, younger, disinterested, reached for his wine. "She is palace property. You do not want to start something with the Crown steward over a wolfless girl. Palace property." Brecon released her wrist with a sound of contempt. "That is all you are, is it not? Property with no wolf, no pack, no claim. Who would even notice if you vanished?" Seraphine stepped back. She aligned her tray. She continued down the wall. Her wrist throbbed where his grip had been, but she did not rub it. She counted her own steps. 14 paces to the next table. She could do 14 paces. She had survived 4 years of this palace. She could survive 1 more evening. She was wrong about the evening. The room shifted at 1/2 the first bell, a change in pressure. Subtle as the moment before a storm, when the air compresses and goes very still. Seraphine felt it before she understood it. The conversations nearest the great doors faltered, then stopped entirely. Silence spreading outward like a stone dropped in still water. Around her, wolves who had been slouched with drink were straightening. She watched men who had commanded rooms full of alphas, dropped their eyes to the floor. She turned, slowly. He stood at the entrance to the hall. She had heard of the Alpha King, of course. Veilthorn was his palace. This was his realm. But she had served in the eastern wing for 4 years, the servants' quarters and the lower chambers, and in all that time she had never once been in the same room as Caius Veilthorn, High King of the Northern Realm, Alpha of Alphas, whose name alone was enough to make grown wolves press their necks bare in involuntary submission. She understood why now. He was tall, taller than any man in the hall, broad through the shoulder, in the way of wolves who ran not for pack hunts, but for something older and more solitary. His hair was dark, and his jaw was carved from something harder than patience. He wore black from throat to heel, no decoration except the silver wolf's head clasp at his collar, and he moved through the hall the way a storm moved through open country, not fast, not aggressive, simply inevitable. Wolves parted before him. The ones who could not step back in time pressed themselves against tables and columns, heads angled down, and he did not acknowledge any of them. His eyes swept the room. They were gray, not the soft gray of morning sky, but the gray of iron that had been in a fire heated, dense, carrying a residual heat that had nowhere to go. His gaze moved over her, past her, then it stopped and came back. Seraphine looked away immediately. Her heart was hammering in a way she did not understand. She focused on her tray. She focused on the next table. She was nothing in this room. She was wallpaper and candlelight and silence, and there was no reason none for the Alpha King's gaze to have caught on her face the way it had. There was no reason for the sudden warmth that had bloomed in the center of her chest when his eyes found hers. She moved away. She kept moving. She told herself it meant nothing. Her tray slipped from her hands at the far end of the hall, a moment of sheer lightheadedness, a sudden wave of dizziness that had been building since she stepped into the hall. Since she had not eaten properly in 3 days, because Lady Voss had cut the servant rations again, for some minor infraction Seraphine had not even committed. The goblets did not shatter. They bounced against the stone floor with a sound that was, in the silence of that moment, catastrophic. Every head in the hall turned. She crouched immediately to gather them, her hands shaking, her vision narrowing at the edges. The dizziness was worse when she bent down. She breathed through it. She would not collapse in the hall. She would not. What in the moon goddess's name is wrong with you? Lady Voss was there instantly, a knife-thin whisper that carried more threat than shouting. She caught Seraphine's upper arm and hauled her upright. "You clumsy, worthless Lady Voss." The voice came from across the hall, and it was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the kind of voice that existed at a frequency that bypassed conscious hearing and went directly to the part of the brain that recognized apex predators. Lady Voss's hand released Seraphine's arm as though burned. Caius Veilthorn stood 6 feet away. He had crossed half the hall in the time it had taken Seraphine to straighten, and she had not heard him move. No one had. The wolves nearest him had gone completely motionless. "That girl is unwell," he said. He was looking at Lady Voss, but Seraphine could feel the weight of his attention like a second presence in the room. "She has not eaten." It was not a question. His nostrils had barely flared, but she understood. He had scented it. Starvation had a particular note, a sharpness, a hollowness that a wolf of his rank would identify the way a physician identified fever. Lady Voss made a sound that attempted recovery. "Your Majesty, I assure you, the staff are. She is trembling," he said, still flat. She has been trembling for the last quarter hour. A pause. Was she given a meal before this service? Lady Voss said nothing. The silence was its own answer. Take her to the healer's quarters, the Alpha King said. Now, she does not return to service tonight. He turned away. The room exhaled. Conversations resumed in a rush of voices, as if everyone needed to collectively pretend they had not just witnessed the most powerful wolf in the realm stop an assembly feast to notice a wolfless servant girl. Seraphine stood very still. She felt the warmth in her chest again, deeper this time. Undeniable, like something that had been banked under ash for years and had just been given air. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and told herself it was hunger. It was only hunger. It meant nothing at all. By the time she reached the healer's chambers, her legs had stopped cooperating entirely, and the elder woman who met her at the door, small, silver-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who had seen too much to be easily surprised, caught her by the elbow and guided her to a low cot with the practiced ease of a woman who caught falling things for a living. Sit, the healer said. Her name was Marin, though Seraphine did not know that yet. Before you make my floor interesting. Seraphine sat. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs to stop the shaking. The healer was already moving, ladling something warm from a pot on the iron stove broth, thick with herbs, smelling of salt and something deep and restorative that made Seraphine's eyes sting unexpectedly. Drink it before you speak, Marin said, pressing the bowl into her hands. She drank. The warmth spread outward from her stomach with a gentleness that almost undid her composure entirely. She had not realized how cold she had been until she began to thaw. 3 days? Marin asked, settling on a stool across from her, dark eyes observant and quiet. Since the morning of the 4th day before this, Seraphine said. Then, because honesty required precision, half rations for 2 weeks before that. Marin was quiet for a moment. Lady Voss's doing? Seraphine did not answer. You do not need to protect her, the healer said. She does not protect you. I am aware. Seraphine looked at the bowl in her hands. I am not protecting her. I simply do not have the energy to be angry tonight. The healer studied her for a long moment with eyes that seemed to look past the surface of things. Then she said, quietly and almost to herself, Interesting. Seraphine looked up. What is? Marin shook her head and said nothing more. But something in her expression had shifted something careful, watchful, and oddly reverent, and Seraphine did not know what to make of it. She did not have the resources to make anything of it. She drank her broth and let the warmth do its work, and when Marin indicated the narrow cot in the corner of the chamber and said she could sleep there for the night, Seraphine did not argue. She dreamed of gray eyes. She dreamed of warmth. She dreamed of a wolf so large it blotted out the moon, and it was sitting at the edge of the forest, looking at her with an expression that was not threatening at all. That was, impossibly, something closer to recognition. She woke before dawn to find a cloth-covered tray on the floor beside the cot. Bread, cheese, a small pot of honey, and something wrapped in linen that proved to be a portion of roasted meat still warm from the kitchen fires. There was no note. There was no explanation. Marin, crossing the chamber with a bundle of dried herbs, glanced at the tray with an expression so carefully neutral it told Seraphine everything. She looked at the food. She looked at the healer. Marin said nothing. Seraphine ate every single thing on the tray methodically and tried very hard not to assign meaning to any of it. She failed. 3 days passed in a strange suspension between her ordinary life and something she did not have language for yet. Marin kept her in the healer's chambers under the pretext of recovery. which Lady Voss protested in a message that arrived by the second morning, sharp-edged and formal in its phrasing. Marin read it, set it aside, and did not respond. Seraphine watched this with a mix of awe and anxiety that she kept carefully behind her teeth. On the second day, a child appeared in the healer's doorway. She was perhaps 6 years old, one of the orphaned pups that the palace kept small wolves whose packs had dissolved through violence or disease, children who lived in the lower wards under the supervision of rotating nursemaids who were competent but not warm. This one had dark braids and enormous amber eyes and a quality of stillness unusual in a child her age. She stood in the doorway and looked at Seraphine with the particular, unfiltered directness that only children and very old people possessed. "You smell like the forest at night," the child said. Seraphine looked at her. "Do I? And like moonstone?" The child tilted her head. "Mama always said moonstone smells like light that belongs to something old." Marin, behind Seraphine, made a sound that might have been a sharp intake of breath. Seraphine did not turn around. She looked at the child. "What is your name?" she asked. "Lyra," the child said. Then, with the absolute conviction of someone who does not understand why this should be surprising, "The big wolf knows you. He said so." "The big wolf?" Seraphine asked carefully. Lyra pointed in the direction of the throne wing. Then she turned and vanished back down the corridor with the swift, absolute certainty of small children on their way to somewhere else entirely. Seraphine sat with that for a long moment. She turned to find Marin watching her with the same expression the healer had worn since the first night measuring, careful, full of something that had not yet been named. "What is she talking about?" Seraphine asked. Marin considered her for a long moment. "She is talking about the Alpha King's wolf," she said at last. The wolf operates separately from the man at times. When it recognizes something important, it becomes restless. The palace staff have noticed he has been restless since the feast. The warmth in Seraphine's chest pulsed once, deep and unmistakable, and she pressed her hand against her sternum and held it there. "That is not possible," she said. Marin said nothing. "I am wolfless," Seraphine said. Her voice was flat. She had said this so many times in her life it had worn grooves in her. "I have no wolf. I have no rank. I am a ward of the Crown's charity. Whatever his wolf is restless about, it is not me." "No," Marin agreed carefully. "Probably not." The way she said it made it clear she believed the opposite entirely. On the third morning, he came. Seraphine was standing at the window of the healer's chamber, watching the first pale light spread across the stone courtyard below, when she heard his footsteps in the corridor measured, unhurried, and carrying a weight that somehow translated through stone floors in a way most footsteps did not. She knew who it was before he appeared in the doorway. The warmth in her chest told her, flaring into something larger the moment he stepped into the room. Caius Valthorn filled the doorframe without effort. He was not wearing his formal robes, only a plain dark tunic and riding leathers, which made him somehow more dangerous looking rather than less, as though ceremony had been the only thing softening the edges. He looked at her. She looked at him. Marin made herself very busy at the far end of the room and did not turn around. "You are recovered?" he said. Not a question. He had scented it. "Yes," Seraphine said. "Thank you, for the food, and for the feast." He looked at her for a moment as though her gratitude was a thing he did not know what to do with. Then he said, "How long has Lady Voss been restricting the servant rations?" "That is not something I should answer," Seraphine said. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, something more controlled than anger, more contained, and therefore more dangerous. "Why not?" "Because I have to continue living in this palace after you leave this room," she said, "and she has a long memory." He was quiet. His gray eyes were very still, and she had the uncomfortable sensation that he was not merely looking at her, but reading her cataloging details the way a warrior cataloged terrain before deciding where to place his soldiers. "What is your name?" he said. She told him. He said it once, quietly, as though testing its weight. Then he said, "No one will touch your rations again, Your Majesty." It was not a comfort. It was information. He turned to go. "Why?" she asked. She had not planned to say it. It simply escaped her, propelled by something she could not suppress entirely. He stopped. He did not turn back for a long moment. When he finally did, there was something in his face just briefly, just at the edge that looked like a man confronting something he did not have a name for yet. "My wolf," he said carefully, "does not make many requests of me. When it does, I have learned to listen." He left. His footsteps retreated down the corridor. The warmth in her chest did not recede with him. It remained, settled and burning and impossible, like a coal placed against her ribs. Maren turned from her herbs. Her expression was no longer careful. It was something closer to wonder. "Seraphine," the healer said softly, "where exactly were you born?" The question lodged under her skin like a splinter. Seraphine turned from the window. "I was told I was found," she said, "at the edge of the Veyrath forest. I was perhaps 2 years old. No pack markings, no identification. The crown took me in." Maren nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something. Her dark eyes were very bright. "By whom?" Seraphine asked. "Why do you ask?" Maren looked at her for a long moment. "I ask," she said at last, "because I have been the royal healer for 40 years, and in 40 years I have smelled every kind of wolf, every bloodline, every rank that this realm produces." She paused. "You do not smell wolfless to me. You never did. You smell like something I have not encountered since before you were born." Seraphine's mouth was dry. "What do I smell like?" Maren set down her herbs. She folded her hands. She looked at Seraphine with the absolute seriousness of a woman who understood the weight of what she was about to say. "Like the moon goddess's own blood," the healer said quietly. "Like the luminary line. Like a bloodline this realm believes was extinguished 20 years ago. The silence stretched between them like something about to break." That evening, Seraphine was summoned to the Alpha King's council chamber. Not as a servant, not as a ward. She was summoned by name by the king's own herald, with a formality that made 3 senior betas stare at her in the corridor as she passed. She wore the same servant's gray. She had nothing else. She walked with her hands clasped in front of her and her spine very straight, and her mind very carefully walled against everything Maren had told her. Because if she let those walls down, she would not be able to walk at all. The council chamber was smaller than she expected for a room where kingdoms were decided. A round table of black iron, 6 high-backed chairs, and a fireplace large enough to stand in. Caius was already there, standing at the far window with his back to her, looking out over the training grounds below. 2 of his advisors sat at the table, men she did not know, who looked at her with expressions ranging from puzzlement to poorly concealed contempt. "You asked for the servant girl, Majesty," the older of the 2 said. "She has a name," Caius said, without turning from the window. "Use it." The advisor's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Seraphine crossed the room and stood beside the table, not quite at it. She waited. Caius turned. He looked at her with those iron-gray eyes, and she felt the warmth in her chest respond a rush that moved through her like sound moves through water, everywhere at once. "I have made inquiries," he said, "about the conditions of the servant quarters, about rationing, about Lady Voss's management of the palace staff." "Your Majesty," the younger advisor began. "I did not ask for comment," Caius said, still looking at Seraphine. The advisor fell silent. "I have also," Caius continued, "made inquiries with Marin. She has told me what she shared with you this afternoon." Seraphine kept her face very still. "Then you know as much as I do." "More," he said. "I know the luminary bloodline. I know its history. I know what it means for this realm if what Marin believes is accurate." A pause. "I also know what it means for you, specifically, if the wrong people learn of it before it can be confirmed." Something cold moved through her chest alongside the warmth. She thought of Lady Voss. She thought of the particular bitterness beneath the woman's perfume, the targeted cruelty that had always felt less like casual contempt and more like something with a purpose. "How long has Lady Voss been in my household?" Caius asked the older advisor abruptly. The advisor blinked. "She was placed in your steward's role some 20 years ago, Majesty, by your father's council." 20 years ago," Caius said. Seraphine felt the pieces align in her chest with a sound she could almost hear. "I want her quarters searched," Caius said. "Tonight, quietly." He looked at the advisors. "You will say nothing of this to anyone in this palace. Not to your mates, not to your seconds, not to your packmates. If I find that this conversation has left this room before I permit it, there will be consequences that will reach further than your ranks can protect you." Both men nodded. Both left. Seraphine stood alone in the council chamber with the Alpha King, and the fire in the hearth, and the warmth that was becoming impossible to dismiss. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him. For the second time in 2 days, a question had escaped her before she could stop it. He looked at her for a long moment. She watched something move through his expression, the same contained conflict she had seen that morning, the same quality of a man wrestling with something his mind understood, but his instincts had already decided. "Because my wolf has not been wrong in 20 years, he said. "And it is not wrong about you." He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, not the ordinary warmth of a body near a fire, but something else entirely. Something that moved along her skin in a way that should have frightened her, but did not. Something that felt against all logic and reason and the entirety of her rational mind, like coming home. She stepped back. One step, then another. "I am wolfless," she said. Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that. "Whatever your wolf believes, I have no wolf to answer it." He watched her step away. He did not move to stop her. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "that is what someone needed you to believe." She left the chamber. She walked the corridor with her head up and her breathing controlled, and her hand pressed flat against her chest, feeling the pulse of something that had no name yet, but that was becoming, with terrifying certainty, the most real thing she had ever known. The search of Lady Voss's quarters turned up a locked chest behind a false panel in the stewardess's wardrobe, and inside it, a record. Not a journal, not a letter, but a formal record written in the precise hand of a court scribe, dated 22 years ago. Seraphine sat across from Caius in the healer's chambers, Marin present, silent as stone, while the older advisor, who had been dispatched to retrieve the chest, read it aloud in a voice that grew progressively quieter as he reached its contents. The luminary bloodline had not been extinguished in the purge of the Moon Council. One child had survived. An infant, less than 2 years old, hidden by a loyal servant who had carried her as far as the Veyrath forest before she herself was found and killed. The infant had been taken in by the crown. The record named that child. It named Lady Voss as one of 3 palace officials who had been aware of the child's survival and had been paid by whom. The record did not specify, though the cipher used was associated with Lord Cresson of the Eastern Tribunal to suppress her true nature and ensure she never shifted, never came into power, never discovered what she carried in her blood. To ensure this, a binding had been placed. Not a physical binding, a scent binding, administered in small doses through the girl's food from infancy onward, that suppressed the manifestation of her wolf and masked her true bloodline from detection. The stewardess had controlled the servant rations. The silence in the healer's chamber when the advisor finished reading was absolute. Seraphine sat very still. She thought of 4 years in the Eastern Wing, of half rations and less, of Lady Voss's particular attention to the wolfless ward, a cruelty too specific and too sustained to be simple contempt. The warmth in her chest was gone. In its place was something different, cold, clear, and very quiet. Not grief, not yet. Something that had not yet decided what it was. "Is she still in the palace?" Seraphine asked. "She was confined to her quarters when the chest was found," the advisor said. Seraphine looked at Caius. "The binding," she said. "Can it be reversed?" Marin answered before he could. "Yes," the healer said. "It requires time. Days, possibly. But yes." Seraphine nodded once. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs. She kept her face very still and her voice very level, and she said, "Then I would like to begin." The reversal of a scent binding was not dramatic, in the way that Seraphine had half expected it to be. There was no burst of light. There was no sudden, overwhelming transformation that announced itself to the palace. It was slow 4 days of work in Marin's chambers, the healer administering a careful counter-compound that had been stored in the royal archives for exactly this eventuality, as if someone had anticipated that one day this would be needed, as if someone had planned for her survival, even as others planned her suppression. The first day she felt nothing except a headache that settled behind her eyes like a lodger who intended to stay. The second day she woke at 3 a.m. with her skin on fire, not uncomfortably so, not painfully, the way a limb feels when circulation returns to it, bright, almost electric, a million pinpoints of sensation flooding back into something that had been numb so long she had forgotten numb was not simply how existing felt. She lay in the dark and breathed through it, and somewhere beneath the heat she felt something. A stirring, a presence. Like a door she had never known existed had opened a crack in the back of her mind and let in cold forest air. She pressed her hand to the pulse in her throat. Her heart was racing. "I know," she said to the darkness, to the stirring. "I know. I feel you." On the 3rd day, Caius came again. He came alone, which she was learning was unusual. He dismissed the guards from the corridor outside the healer's chamber and closed the door, and for a moment he simply stood there, looking at her where she sat on the cot, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, and the expression on his face was one that she did not have a name for, but that moved through her like a bell being struck. "You were in pain last night," he said. It was not a question. He had scented it. "I was not in pain," she said. "I was waking up." Something moved in his jaw, a tightening. He crossed the chamber and crouched down to her level, an unexpected gesture from a man who was taller than almost everyone in any room he entered, so that his eyes were level with hers, and the heat that radiated from him was close enough to feel like standing beside a hearth. You should have sent word, he said, low, quiet. It was 3 in the morning, she said. I do not sleep well, he said. I have not slept well in 3 days. She looked at him. My wolf, he said, with the controlled restraint of a man choosing each word as carefully as a footstep on uncertain ground, knows when you are distressed. It does not permit me to be unaware of it. The warmth surged in her chest with an intensity that almost took her breath. She looked away from him. She looked at the wall. She said, Caius. She had not used his name before. It surprised them both. You need to be prepared, she said carefully, for the possibility that what your wolf believes is correct. I am not telling you it is. I am telling you that I felt something last night that I have never felt before, and I do not know what it means yet, and I need you to. She stopped. What? He said. I need you to give me time, she said. I have been told my entire life that I am nothing, that I am wolfless, that I have no claim to anything in this world. If what Maren says is true, if what that record says is true, then my entire understanding of what I am has to reform. I cannot do that and also manage. She gestured between them, which was imprecise, but seemed to convey the meaning. He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was tight. Whatever his wolf was doing in the back of his mind, the man was visibly exercising an enormous amount of restraint over it. I am trying to give you time, he said finally. The words carried the weight of something that was costing him. She believed him. That was the frightening part. He was a man who commanded 500 alphas, who had never in his public life been observed giving anything to anyone, and she believed him. Thank you, she said softly. He stood. He moved toward the door. Caius, she said again. He stopped. The child, she said. Lyra, the pup from the lower wards. She told me she said you knew me, that your wolf said so. He turned. Something passed through his face, very briefly, something almost vulnerable, which on the architecture of his features looked startling. She has a talent, he said carefully, for saying the things that adults carefully avoid. He left. Seraphine sat with the warmth in her chest and the stirring in the back of her mind, and for the first time in 4 years in this palace, possibly for the first time in her life, she did not feel invisible. She felt seen, deeply, thoroughly, all the way through seen. The binding broke entirely on the 4th morning. She was standing in the courtyard below the healer's window, Maren having insisted on fresh air as part of the counter-compound regimen, wrapped in a heavy cloak against the early cold, when it happened. Not gradually, not with warning, like a wall coming down sudden, total, structural. The wolf arrived. She had no better word for it. One moment she was standing in the courtyard, and the next she was more. Fuller, as if the dimensions of herself had expanded, as if a room she had always lived in had been revealed to be only an antechamber to something much larger. She felt the wolf the way she felt her own heartbeat, not external, not separate, but integral, foundational, the ground beneath everything she was. And the wolf knew. The wolf looked through her eyes at the courtyard, at the palace walls, at the morning sky, and it knew itself. It knew her. It knew, and this was the part that drove the breath from her lungs, exactly where the Alpha King was in the building behind her, as precisely as if he were lit from within. His location, his warmth, the thread that connected them, which she could now feel not just as a sensation in her chest, but as something almost visible, a filament of gold running from her sternum in the direction of the east wing. She stood very still and breathed, and let the wolf settle around her like water finding its level. Maren appeared beside her. The healer took her hands, turned them palm up, looked at her eyes. "Good morning," Maren said softly. "Good morning," Seraphine said. Her voice sounded different. She could hear the difference. Something in the resonance had changed, as if the frequency she spoke at had shifted into a lower register, one that carried more weight. Maren smiled for the first time since Seraphine had known her. It transformed her face entirely. "The luminary line," the healer said quietly, "was said to carry a gift unlike any ordinary wolf, not just shift strength or alpha dominance, but something rarer. A resonance with the moon goddess's own frequency, the ability to feel the pack bond at its deepest level, to hold it, to sustain it. The ancient texts called it the calming a true Luna's power in its oldest and purest form." Seraphine looked out at the palace around her, at the stone and iron and the morning light on the walls. "What does that mean for me?" she asked. "It means," Maren said carefully, "that when the Alpha King's wolf recognized you on the night of the feast, it was not confused. It was not mistaken. It recognized exactly what you are." A pause. "The fated mate of the Veilthorn line. The true Luna of this realm." The thread of gold in her chest pulled once, insistent. In the east wing, something shifted. She felt it, felt him, felt the moment the Alpha King became aware of what had changed in the quality of the bond, even from that distance, because the scent of his reaction reached her on the morning air, and it was not cold, not contained, not the iron-gray restraint he wore in public. It was devastation and relief, and something fiercer than both, combined. Seraphine closed her eyes. She breathed. She thought of the girl who had pressed herself against walls, the girl who had learned to be invisible, the girl who had been told her entire life that she was nothing, that she had no wolf, no rank, no claim, no future in this world that was not contingent on the charity of others. She opened her eyes. She thought, "Whoever did this to me is still in this palace." And the wolf in her chest agreed. Lord Cresson of the Eastern Tribunal arrived at Veilthorn Palace on the 5th morning since the binding's reversal, which was either very unfortunate timing or very careful timing disguised to look otherwise. He came with 12 guards, a formal writ from the Eastern Council, and a demand that was worded in the language of procedure but structured as an ultimatum. The Alpha King was to appear before the tribunal to answer questions regarding the suppression of evidence related to a 22-year-old investigation into the Luminary Purge. Seraphine stood at the window of the room Caius had moved her to, no longer the healer's chambers, but a proper guest suite in the northern wing, stone walls and heavy tapestries, and a fireplace large enough to heat the entire floor, and watched Cresson's retinue ride through the gates with the cold, clear recognition of someone seeing a thing they had always known was coming. "He received word," she said. Caius stood beside her at the window. He had been beside her more in the last 2 days than he had apparently been beside anyone in years, which she knew from the increasingly strained expressions on his advisors' faces every time they entered a room and found her there. "Someone in this palace told him the binding was broken," Caius said. His voice was very controlled. "Someone with access to information about the counter-compound regimen." "Lady Voss is still in her quarters," Seraphine said. "She is," he said, "under guard, without access to a messenger, unless she already sent one." A pause. "Yes." Seraphine turned from the window. The wolf in her chest was not afraid. It was sharp, focused, carrying a quality of readiness that was entirely new in her experience of herself. "What does he want?" she asked. "What Cresson has always wanted," Caius said. "He wants to discredit the evidence in that record. If the record stands, it names him by cipher as the architect of the binding. It implicates the Eastern Tribunal in the suppression of an ancient bloodline, which carries a sentence this realm has not imposed in a century. His jaw was tight. He has legal standing to challenge the record's authenticity. He will argue it was fabricated. He will call for the testimony of witnesses. "Lady Voss?" Seraphine said. "Yes." "And she will say it is false." "Yes." She looked at him. "Then what proof do we have?" He looked at her for a moment. His eyes dropped briefly to the pulse in her throat and then, lower, to the center of her sternum, where the bond lived. Something moved in his expression that was too intimate and too unguarded to hold for more than a moment. He pulled it back. "You," he said quietly. "You are the proof. What you carry in your blood, Marin can certify the bloodline. A luminary in the flesh is not something Crescent can argue against in front of a full court." A pause. "But it requires you to stand before that court and be what you are, in front of the entire assembly?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The wolf in her chest waited with her, patient and still. "When?" she said. "Tonight," he said. "He is calling for an emergency tribunal session. He wants this resolved before it can build momentum." His eyes met hers. "He wants you removed from this palace before the court has time to recognize what you are." "Then we give him tonight," she said. "We let him believe he is the one controlling the timing." He looked at her with an expression that had shifted into something she was less familiar with. Something that did not belong to the cold, commanding Alpha King the realm feared, but to the man beneath him, who was apparently capable of being surprised. "You have been quiet your entire life," he said. "And you are telling me how to play this." "I have been quiet," she said. "I have also been listening. For 4 years in this palace, I have listened to everything. I know who Crescent's allies are at this court. I know who resents him. I know who is afraid of him and who is merely pretending to be." She met his eyes. "I know things your advisors do not, because your advisors are powerful, and powerful people are not told the truth in servants' quarters." He looked at her for another moment. The expression on his face had no name she knew, but it was fierce and quiet, and it pressed against her from across the space between them like the heat of an open fire. "All right," he said. "All right?" she repeated. "You know this court. Lead." He said it simply, as if it cost him nothing, as if handing control to the wolfless servant girl he had spoken to for the first time 6 days ago was the most natural conclusion he had ever reached. The wolf in her chest went very warm. The emergency tribunal session was called for the 8th bell, in the great hall, not the formal throne room, which would have given Caius the advantage of his own seat, but the great hall, which Crescent had specified in his writ as neutral ground. The court assembled in its entirety. Every alpha present at the mid-year assembly, every ranking official, every beta-level advisor and their retinues. 500 wolves standing because Crescent had refused a seated session as another procedural gambit. Seraphine entered from the servants' corridor. She wore white. Marin had found it a white wool gown from the palace stores, old, cut in the ancient style, with the high collar and the open sleeves that the luminary line had traditionally worn at formal occasions, which she had not known until Marin showed her the tapestry in the healer's archives, and she had recognized her own face in the woman depicted, which had stopped her breath for a full minute. The gown was too large at the waist and too long at the hem, taken in hastily by Marin's capable hands. It was, regardless, unmistakable. The reaction when she walked through the door was not the reaction of a court watching a servant enter a room. The silence that fell was different, older, deeper, the kind of silence that contains recognition of something that predates understanding. She felt it when they scented her. The wolf in her chest was fully open, the scent binding gone. The luminary bloodline unmasked, radiating the frequency Maren had described into every wolf-sensitive nose in the hall. She watched heads turn. She watched wolves, who had never seen her before, go still in a particular way. The involuntary stilling of a predator who has encountered something it recognizes as a dominant frequency. She walked to the center of the hall. Lord Cresson stood at the tribunal's table, a man of 50, silver-haired, small-framed, carrying his authority in his paperwork the way some men carried it in their size. He had wolf's eyes and an accountant's face, and when he looked at her, she saw the calculation in his gaze shift, very briefly, into something older and colder. Fear. "This is the girl?" he said. "This is what you have." "This is Seraphine of the Luminary line," Caius said. He had entered from the opposite door. He stood at the far end of the hall, and the court split between them, a natural pulling apart, every wolf in the room orienting toward one pole or the other, and the poles were the Alpha King in his black iron and the woman in white standing in the center of the floor. "The Luminary line is extinct," Cresson said. His voice was perfectly composed. "This is a fabrication, a manipulation by the Crown to discredit the Eastern Tribunal in a matter of legitimate governance." "Smell her," said a voice. It was Lyra. The child was standing at the edge of the crowd near the servants' entrance, her small face composed and her amber eyes fixed on Cresson with an unchildlike steadiness. Someone must have brought her here. She could not have found this room alone. "Smell her," Lyra said again, to the hall at large. "You all know what you smell?" "You have been smelling it since she walked in." The silence in the hall changed texture. "Speak then," Seraphine said. She spoke clearly into the silence. Not loudly. She did not need to be loud. The luminary frequency was already in the room, already in their noses, and her voice moved on it the way a stone moved on still water. "Any wolf in this hall who believes I am what Lord Cresson says I am, speak. Tell me I do not smell like the line he says is extinct." No one spoke. Cresson's jaw moved. He turned to the tribunal officials beside him. He began to say something about certification procedures and the standards of bloodline evidence. "I have the original binding contract," Maren said from the doorway. The healer entered with a document case that she set on the nearest table and opened with precise, deliberate movements. Signed by Lord Cresson of the Eastern Tribunal. Dated 22 years ago. Certifying the administration of a scent-binding compound to the surviving child of the Luminary Purge, for the purpose of suppressing her wolf and her bloodline identity, at the instruction and financing of the Eastern Council's Security Division. Maren looked at the hall. "I kept a copy. I have kept it for 20 years. I was the healer who was ordered to administer the compound. I refused. Another healer was found." She looked at Cresson. "But I kept the contract." The hall erupted. Not in chaos, in the particular sound of 500 wolves reaching the same conclusion simultaneously, a wave of sound that moved from the tribunal table outward and broke against the far walls. Cresson was moving, or trying to. His guards had stepped forward, and Caius's guards had responded in kind, and in the space of 10 seconds, the great hall had reorganized itself along lines that everyone in it understood, those who were with the Alpha King and those who were with the Eastern Tribunal, and the count of that reorganization was not close. Seraphine stood in the center of it and did not move. She felt the bond. She felt it fully now, a cord of heat running from her chest in Caius's direction. Pulling with a gravity she was no longer fighting. She looked across the hall at him, and he was already looking at her. He had not looked away since she entered, and the expression on his face was not the Alpha King's controlled, iron-gray command. It was a man watching something he had wanted with absolute certainty come true. Cresson broke for the side door. He did not reach it. Caius moved faster than eyes could properly track the controlled speed of a Lycan of his rank. Fluid and absolutely certain, and he was between Cresson and the door before the older man's guards had processed the motion. "You will not leave this hall," he said. "Quiet, absolute." Cresson turned. He was afraid now scent fear, open and undeniable, and every wolf in the room smelled it. His composure had collapsed. What remained beneath it was the face of a man who had made a calculation 22 years ago and had simply not believed, until this moment, that it would fail him. "This realm is governed by law," Cresson said, and his voice was almost steady. "You cannot." "The law of this realm," Caius said, "places the protection of an ancient bloodline above every tribunal procedure, every council writ, and every personal interest of any lord in this kingdom. The law you yourself cited when you drafted the suppression order." A pause. "The same law that now governs your judgment." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Two of his senior betas moved to flank Cresson. The man did not resist. He was, perhaps, wise enough to understand that resistance was no longer a viable strategy. The calculation had shifted, and he knew it. Seraphine watched this from the center of the hall. Around her, the court had gone quiet again, a different kind of quiet now, waited and wondering. She felt their eyes on her. She felt the shift in how she was being perceived, the recalibration happening in real time in every wolf brain in that room. Then Caius was in front of her. He had crossed the hall, and she had not tracked his movement. And now, he was close, very close, the heat of him immediate and overwhelming, the bond blazing between them at a frequency she could feel in her teeth. He looked at her for a long moment. Around them, 500 wolves held their breath. "In front of this court," he said, and his voice was low and deliberate. "In front of every witness in this hall, you are mine. This realm's true Luna. The fated mate of the Veilthorn line." A pause. His gray eyes were dark, stripped of their public armor, carrying something private and enormous that he was choosing, right now, to make public. "Do you refuse it?" She thought of the girl who had pressed herself against walls, the girl who had been told she was nothing. She thought of Lyra, smelling moonstone and saying, "The big wolf knows you." She thought of a tray of food left outside a cot before dawn, with no note and no explanation. She looked at him. "No," she said, "I do not refuse it." The sound that rose from the court was not applause. It was something older, a howl that began with one wolf and was taken up by another and another, until the great hall rang with it from wall to wall. The sound wolves made at the completion of a true bond, at the recognition of their Luna, at the confirmation of something fated being allowed, finally, to be what it was. Seraphine felt the wolf in her chest rise to meet it. Lady Voss was brought from her quarters into the great hall by two of the Alpha King's guards. She came with the particular stillness of someone who had already calculated her situation and found no favorable exits. She was dressed with her usual precision, every hair in place, her expression composed into something that was meant to read as dignity, but smelled to every wolf in the room of cold, specific fear. She saw Seraphine standing at the center of the hall, in white, with the Alpha King at her side, and the expression that moved through her face in the half-second before she controlled, it was not surprise. It was the look of a woman watching an outcome she had spent 20 years preventing arrive regardless. Seraphine did not feel triumph. She had expected to feel something sharp and gratifying, the face slap of reversal, the completion of a long-delayed reckoning. What she felt instead was quieter and more final than that. The satisfaction simply of the truth being in the room. Lady Mordecai Voss, the senior beta, read from the document Marin had provided, his voice carrying into the hall's attentive silence. You are charged with the knowing suppression of an ancient bloodline by means of administered compound, with the deliberate restriction of food from the ward under your care as a mechanism of continued suppression, with communication of privileged palace information to Lord Cresson of the Eastern Tribunal, and with complicity in the original Purge conspiracy by virtue of your role as the Crown's appointed steward, a position taken at the instruction of the Eastern Council for the specific purpose of monitoring and suppressing the survivor. Lady Voss said nothing. Her composure was remarkable technically, but her scent was everything. You knew, Seraphine said. It was not an accusation. It was simply an acknowledgement. She said it quietly, looking at the woman who had spent 4 years ensuring she did not eat enough to sustain her wolf's awakening, who had assigned her the work that kept her invisible, who had told her 100 times in 100 ways that she was nothing. From the beginning, Seraphine said, you knew what I was. Lady Voss looked at her. For just a moment, just one, the composure shifted, and what was underneath it was not guilt, but something rawer and stranger, the particular expression of a person who had spent so long fearing something that they had forgotten, somewhere along the way, that the thing they feared was human. It was not personal, Lady Voss said. Her voice was very quiet. It was never personal. I know, Seraphine said. That is almost worse. She turned away. She did not have anything else to say to Lady Voss. The woman would face judgment. The tribunal's procedures, properly applied now, under the law that Cresson had thought would protect him. What happened next was not Seraphine's to decide. The Alpha King's hand found her wrist as she turned, not a grip, not a restraint, just fingers resting against her pulse with a lightness that asked rather than took. She felt the warmth of him through her skin, traveling up her arm, settling in her chest alongside the wolf's steady glow. She looked at him. His wolf was right there. In his eyes, she could see it clearly now, without the confusion and noise of the suppressed bond. The wolf that had recognized her at the feast, that had paced and grown restless in the days since, that had operated independently of the man in the way Marin had described, leaving food outside cots and dismissing guards from corridors and crossing halls at speeds that exceeded ordinary motivation. The wolf looked at her with absolute recognition, and the man, behind it, was watching her with something that had waited a long time to be allowed to exist. The mark, he said quietly. Not here, not now, not under pressure of tribunal and spectacle. He was giving her the choice. He was still, impossibly, giving her the choice. When you are ready, on your terms, she thought. This man, who commands 500 alphas and has never in his public life been seen to give way, has spent the last 6 days finding new ways to give me something I did not know I was allowed to ask for. She thought, I have been running from the warmth since the night I felt it, and I am tired of running from warm things. Tonight, she said, in the moon pool, after this is done. He looked at her. Something in his face broke open, just for a moment, just enough to see the breadth of what was behind it. Tonight, he agreed. The moon pool lay beyond the palace's northern gate, through a 1/4 mile of ancient forest, where the trees grew so close together that moonlight arrived in pale columns between the branches. Seraphine walked it alone. She had asked for that, and he had accepted it. her white gown gathering dew from the undergrowth as she moved between the trunks. The wolf in her chest, wide awake and pulling her forward with a certainty that had nothing to do with direction and everything to do with destination. She had been told about the moon pool by Marin, who had described it in the careful, reverent language of someone recounting a sacred thing. A natural formation, older than the palace, older than the Veilthorn line itself, a perfectly circular pool fed by an underground spring, its floor lined with pale moonstone that caused the water to hold light the way glass held color, glowing from within even on moonless nights. The mating ceremony had been performed at its edge for every alpha king of the realm since the first stones of Veilthorn were laid. She heard it before she saw it, a quality of silence that was different from the silence of the forest, deeper, more deliberate, the silence of a place that had held so many solemn things it had learned how to keep them. She stepped through the last line of trees and stopped. The pool was exactly as Marin had described. Perhaps 30 feet across, perfectly round, the water holding the moonlight in its surface like a mirror made of something more patient than glass. The moonstone beneath gave it a pale luminescence that rose through the water in slow pulses, like breathing. Around its edges, the forest opened in a natural circle, and the sky above was clear and full of stars, the moon directly overhead as though it had arranged itself. Caius was already there. He stood at the far edge of the pool, his back to the forest, and he had come without his black formal coat, only the dark tunic and riding leathers, which she had come to understand was as close as he came to unarmored. He had heard her footsteps the moment she entered the clearing. He did not turn immediately. When he did, the expression on his face in the moonlight was not the Alpha King's face. It was the man's face, stripped of everything procedural, carrying nothing but the full weight of what this moment was. She crossed the clearing slowly. The moonstone light reflected on her white gown and cast her in a pale luminescence that made her wolf feel the resonance in the ground beneath her feet, the frequency of this place, ancient and intentional, tuned to exactly what she was. She stopped an arm's length from him. The bond between them was fully open now, the gold thread she had felt as a filament now more like a current, moving in both directions, carrying information she was only beginning to learn to read. She could feel the contained enormity of what he was holding back the Alpha King's wolf, which had spent 6 days in barely managed restraint, pressing at every boundary he had set for it, with the patience of something that understood waiting but had reached the outermost limit of it. "You came," he said, as if there had been a possibility she would not. "I came," she confirmed. He reached out. His hand moved to her face slowly, giving her the full geometry of the motion. No surprises, and his palm came to rest against her cheek with a tenderness that was completely at odds with the power she knew lived in that hand. She felt the heat of him blaze into her skin. She felt the wolf in her chest lunge toward it, and she let it. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice was steady. "Before?" He waited. "I do not know how to be this," she said. "A Luna, a mate, any of it. I have spent my entire life learning to take up as little space as possible, and what you are asking of me is the opposite of that. I do not know if I will do it well." He looked at her for a long moment. His thumb moved, once, across her cheekbone, a gesture so small it should not have carried the weight it did. "I have ruled this realm for 7 years," he said. "I have never once done it well by anyone's estimation except my own. And I have been alone in a way that is not about proximity." His jaw moved. "I do not need you to be a Luna perfectly. I need you to be here." She pressed her hand over his against her own cheek. "I am here," she said. The mark was not what she had expected, and it was exactly what she had expected. He drew her close with the careful deliberateness of a man who understood the magnitude of what he was about to do, and was not rushing it, his arms around her, his chin at her temple, the heat of him surrounding her completely, and the wolf in her chest, responding with an intensity that made her grip the front of his tunic and hold on. She felt his wolf rise. She felt it in the air between them, in the pressure against her skin, in the way the bond blazed from warm to incandescent. She turned her head. She bared the curve of her neck without being asked, because the wolf in her knew this the way it knew her own heartbeat naturally, without instruction, without effort. His breath was warm against her pulse. A pause, one last pause. The man making certain of the choice, and then the mark came. And it was exactly what Maren had described. Pain that transformed mid-arrival into something that had no clean name in any language she knew. Fire, light, completion. The sensation of a circuit closing that had been open her entire life. A frequency finding its partner frequency after years of vibrating alone into silence. A sound she had not known she had been making with everything she was, suddenly answered. She made a sound she would not have recognized as her own voice. The moonstone beneath the pool flared. The water lit from within with a pulse of white gold that rose and spread in a ring from the pool's center outward, and the forest around them went very bright. Very briefly, every leaf and branch and stone caught in light that had no visible source and disappeared before it could be questioned. She felt the bond seal. She felt it the way you feel a locked door give way, sudden, irreversible, opening onto something vast. She could feel him now the way she could feel her own wolf, not his thoughts, not his words, but his state. His presence, the enormity of what he was, and the quieter thing inside it that only she would ever be permitted to know. She pulled back enough to look at his face. He looked, for the first time since she had known him, like a man who had put down something very heavy. She understood. She felt it too, the particular lightness of something that has been withheld for so long that the withholding has become its own weight. She pressed her forehead to his chest. He held her. The moon pool breathed its light around them. The forest was very quiet, and the stars were very close, and somewhere in the palace behind them, the realm was already becoming something different slowly, irreversibly, as things always did when a true bond completed, and the power that had been waiting to return to its proper place began to move. The morning after the marking, Valthorn Palace woke differently. Seraphine felt it before she opened her eyes, a change in the quality of the air, a shift in the tenor of the pack bond that ran through every wolf in the palace like shared blood. She had felt it before only as noise, as the distant hum of something she was excluded from by the suppression. Now she felt it fully, and she was part of it, and it was part of her, and the adjustment was so significant that she lay still for several minutes, simply processing the sensation of belonging to a place after years of existing in it without connection. She was in the Alpha King's chambers. She had not fully registered the night before how large they were a room for a man who was the anchor of an entire realm's power, proportioned accordingly. Stone walls hung with heavy tapestries in the Valethorn colors of black and silver. A fireplace that could have hosted a dinner party. Windows that looked east over the training grounds in the forest beyond, where the Veyrath trees were catching the early light. Caius was awake. He was standing at one of those windows, dressed, but without the formal pieces of his Alpha King armor, holding a document he was not reading. She knew he was not reading it because she could feel his attention, through the bond, oriented entirely in her direction, the way a compass needle ignores distance. "You have been awake for an hour," she said. He turned. 40 minutes. You were watching me sleep. I was standing at the window." "You were watching me sleep?" she said. "From the window?" Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile. The architecture of his features did not easily accommodate smiling. She was learning, but was the cousin of it. Something that lived in the same neighborhood and occasionally borrowed its expression. He set the document down and crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed at the far edge, a careful distance, and looked at her with the morning light behind him, turning his dark hair to something almost soft. "The tribunal meets at the second bell," he said. "Krisan will be formally charged. Lady Voss will testify. The process will take several days." "I know," she said. "You will need to be present," he said, "as the primary injured party, as the luminary heir. The court will need to see you in that context, not as something the Crown produced, but as something that existed before any of them had a say in it." "I know that too," she said. Marin explained the procedure. He looked at her. "You are not afraid. I was afraid for 4 years," she said. "I used up a great deal of it. I do not have much left for formal procedures." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said quietly, "There will be alphas who resist your rank, who will challenge it, procedurally or otherwise. The Eastern Tribunal has allies who will not accept the verdict easily." "Then we face them," she said. "Together." The word settled between them. Together. He looked at it the way she suspected he looked at all words that had rarely applied to him with a particular attention, as if to memorize the weight of it before it could be taken back. Together, he agreed. She sat up. She looked at him across the morning light. The bond was steady between them, warm and real and thoroughly impossible, and she felt no desire to explain it away. "Caius," she said, "what did you feel?" "The first night, at the feast." He was quiet for a moment, like something that had been displaced for a very long time found its position. He said, "Like the specific silence after a sound you have been straining to hear finally arrives." A pause. My wolf knew immediately. The man, he stopped. "The man took longer," she said. "The man had a great deal of structure to dismantle," he said, and the dry precision of it was so unexpected that she felt something warm and wholly unexpected move through her. Not the bond, not the wolf, but something purely her own. Something light. "You should know," she said, "that I am going to be difficult. I have years of silence to make up for, and I intend to spend them arguing with your advisors." He looked at her. That not smile again, deeper now. "I am counting on it," he said. "My advisors have been unchallenged for years. It has made them comfortable in ways that are not useful." She swung her legs off the bed. The stone floor was cold through her feet, and the morning light was spreading fully through the eastern windows now, and she could hear, distantly, the sounds of the palace waking voices in the corridors, the smell of bread from the kitchens, the clatter of the training grounds being prepared for the morning session. She had heard all of these sounds for 4 years. They were exactly the same. She was not. She stood. She walked to the window beside him and looked out at the palace she had pressed herself against walls to survive. And she felt the wolf in her chest look with her calm, grounded, fully present. And she thought of Lyra and of Marin and of a cloth-covered tray of food left outside a cot before dawn without explanation. She turned to look at him. "The child?" she said. "Lyra," What happens to her? He blinked a rare thing, that small show of surprise. What do you mean? She is in the lower wards, Seraphine said. With rotating nursemaids. She is 6 years old, and she is the most perceptive creature in this palace, and she is being raised by schedule rather than by anyone who knows her. A pause. I would like to change that. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression had shifted into the territory she was beginning to recognize as his version of moved controlled, barely visible, but real. As you wish, he said quietly. I will be saying that phrase to you often, she said. You should practice being comfortable with it. The not smile became something more definitive, undeniable. She committed it to memory. The Grand Assembly convened 3 days later, not the informal emergency session Crescent had called, but the full formal assembly, summoned by the Alpha King's seal, attended by every ranking wolf in the Northern Realm. They filled the great hall to its outermost walls, standing 5 deep in the back, with representatives from 14 packs and every council division, and 3 foreign delegations who had received news of the previous week's events and traveled through night to be present. Seraphine entered from the main door. She wore white again. Marin had found something proper this time: white wool, with the luminary border in silver thread, the ancient pattern, the kind of garment that announced its own history to anyone with the bloodline knowledge to read it. She wore her hair unbound, which was the old mark of a Luna presenting herself to a court for the first time. She wore no jewelry except a single moonstone pendant on a chain so fine it was almost invisible, Marin's gift, pressed into her hand that morning with a look that needed no words. She walked to the center of the hall. The silence that fell was the same silence as the first time she had entered a room in white, but deeper now, completed by the mark, which every wolf in the hall could scent on her: the bond seal, the Alpha King's claim, the luminary bloodline fully open and unmasked for the first time in 22 years. She felt it in the quality of the air. She felt the pack bond respond to her presence the way water responds to a stone, not resistance, but recognition. A ripple of something involuntary moving outward from her, through every wolf in the room. Caius stood at the front of the hall, beside the iron chair of the Valthorn line, not seated, standing, which was deliberate. He watched her walk toward him with the gray iron of his eyes entirely stripped of their public armor, and she felt through the bond the enormity of what he was feeling and the absolute steadiness with which he was holding it. She reached him. She turned to face the hall. 500 wolves looked at her. Outside, through the hall's high windows, the sky was pale gold early morning, the sun just clearing the Verath forest, the light the particular color of new things. Caius stepped to her side. Not in front, not behind, beside. This realm has not had a true Luna in 20 years, he said, and his voice carried to the hall's farthest walls without being raised. The absence was not natural, it was made. What was made can be unmade. He paused. She stands before you not by my appointment, not by council approval, not by procedural certification. She stands before you because she is, what she has always been, and the moon recognizes her whether this court does or not. Another pause. But I believe you do. He looked at Seraphine. She looked at the hall. She thought of the girl against the wall. She thought of the wolf in her chest, stirring in the dark. She thought of all the things she had been told she was not, and she thought of Marin saying, "You smell like the moon goddess's own blood," and she took a breath. "I am not asking for your loyalty," she said, and her voice came out lower and steadier than she had expected, carrying that frequency Marin had described. The calming, moving through the air like a hand placed on something agitated and going still. "I am not asking for your belief. I am only asking for this one morning that you let what you know to be true be true." She paused. "The rest will follow." The howl began at the back of the hall. A single wolf, older, one of the ranking betas from the southern pack, tipping his head back with the involuntary submission and recognition of a wolf responding to its Luna's frequency. It spread pack by pack, wolf by wolf, moving forward through the hall in a wave that she felt in her own chest, the pack bond resonating with each addition, growing, deepening, filling the hall with sound that rose through the stone walls and through the floors and out through the high windows into the morning sky above Valethorn Palace. She stood in the center of it and let it happen, and felt the wolf in her chest answer, quietly, fully, with a sound she had not known until this moment she was capable of. Beside her, Caius's hand found hers. His fingers closed around hers without force or choice, simply to hold. She felt through the bond the steady, fierce, enormous thing he carried, the weight of a kingdom and the private weight of a man who had ruled it alone for too long, and she felt his relief at sharing it, and she held his hand back. Around them, the howl filled the hall, filled the palace, filled the early morning air above the Veyrath forest, where a girl had been found 22 years ago without a name or a pack or a wolf, and carried her forward at last into everything she had always been.